The Uncanny X-Men were conceived in 1963 by writer Stan Lee and artist Jack Kirby, and were billed on the first issue's front cover as the strangest superheroes of all. This was for one distinct reason that set them apart from the other superheroes at the time. They didn't have a fantastical origin story, whether that be cosmic rays or a radioactive spider. The X-Men were simply born with their abilities. While Lee admitted this was originally just to make his job easier, he came to realise the potential that lay in a new species of so-called mutants that were born different from regular humans. In a 2000 interview with The Guardian, Lee said, "It was a good metaphor for what was happening with the civil rights movement in the country at that time. However, 1963's version of the X-Men was very different than what it is today. Each member of the team was both white and straight. What Lee and Kirby were trying to achieve was representation, which at its core is how a text portrays race, gender, ethnicity, nationality, disability, or any other aspects of a person's identity." This video essay will focus on analysing several different comic book stories, as well as parts of the movie adaptation, to decide which parts of the X-Men make for good, effective representation, and whether or not representation through metaphor always works. Chapter 1. The Failure of the Mutant Metaphor. As much as fans and scholars alike, such as Parks and Huey, seem to see X-Men leader Professor Xavier as some sort of thinly veiled adaptation of Martin Luther King Jr., it's clear that what's referred to as the Silver Age of X-Men comics, which began with Lee and Kirby in 1963 and ran through to the early 1970s, doesn't fall into the bracket of representation. With three of the characters being middle-class straight white boys, and an upper-class straight white boy and a middle-class straight white girl rounding out the team, Lee and Kirby clearly didn't show any interest in representing black and ethnic minorities in their X-Men title at the time. In fact, Marvel Comics didn't even introduce its first black character in the Black Panther until 1966, who was the only ethnic minority to appear in the first 10 years of X-Men comics, even if it was just for one issue in a few panels in an Avengers crossover. Before the Panther's introduction, the closest black readers had to representation were 5 white teenagers with extraordinary powers that protected a so-called world that hates and fears them, which admittedly was quite an apt description of the way some white Americans felt about African Americans at the time. Chapter 2. Recontextualizing the Metaphor. When writer Len Wein rebooted the X-Men title in 1975 with the help of artist Dave Cockrum, the two focused on trying to make the team more diverse by introducing new members from across the world. New additions included the Japanese Sunfire, a Native American character called Thunderbird, and my personal favourite, Nightcrawler the German Catholic. The most interesting new addition, however, was Storm, a black Kenyan mutant with the ability to control the weather. Storm's immensely strong powers, coupled with the character and kindly personality she was given under new writer Chris Claremont, made her become one of Marvel's most popular heroes, and arguably the most popular female superhero by the time the 1980s came around. According to Damore, Storm complicated the ways that conservative gender roles permeated the superheroine's representation, and demanded changes to a dialogue that was now more than a decade old. The introduction of this character alone widely improved not only the representation of black characters in the book, but women as well, which only improved in the years to come, as known feminist writer Claremont continued to write the X-Men. Chapter 3. Queer Subtext. Throughout his run on the characters, it became clear that Claremont cared just as much about representing marginalised group on the page as he did about the mutant metaphor. However, the 1980s was plagued with a cruel and unfair censorship program known as the Comics Code Authority. This program, which all Marvel Comics had to follow in fear of low sales, was brought about by Frederick Wortham's 1954 book, Seduction of the Innocent, which warned parents that comic books were turning children into juvenile delinquents. This meant that sex could never be shown or discussed on panel, which unfortunately at the time included all references to homosexuality, which was still somewhat of a taboo topic at the time. Thus, Claremont utilised subtext to infer homosexual relationships between his characters, to bypass the censorship laws. Subtext can be described as context that isn't explicitly told, but rather is implied by the creator, or as a unique reading that the reader themselves picks up on. One of the biggest examples of this in the X-Men comics is the relationship between Mystique and Destiny. Mystique, as a shapeshifter, is already in and of herself an inherently queer character, as she consistently uses her powers to switch between male and female forms. In his journal article, The Feminine Mystique, Rusk describes her as a transgressive character, and a villain/woman/lesbian/mother/shapeshifter, who destabilises the binary oppositions of the superhero universe. Although it wasn't stated textually on panel until 2020's X-Men issue 6, Mystique had been married to Irene Adler, also known as Destiny, since her first appearance in 1978, which had been communicated purely through subtext until that point. The characters embrace each other and tell each other they love them, but it was always communicated in a way that could be perceived as platonic, despite Claremont's intention for it to be a lesbian relationship. But can this queer subtext be considered real representation for the LGBT community? Kanda argues that queer subtexts subvert heteronormative assumptions, and in the process create recognisable representations of queerness. And I would agree, considering this was the closest the writers at the time could do to having queer characters on the page. Chapter 4. Changing the Metaphor. As time went on and more writers began to touch the book, the mutant metaphor transformed from one exclusively representing race to one that could apply to gender, sexuality, and even disability. In 2001's clever and cerebral new X-Men, writer Grant Morrison starts off with a mutant-targeted terrorist attack, and the fallout and trauma that comes from most of the world's mutant population being murdered. This genocide draws parallels to the real-world events of the Holocaust, which in turn has Morrison drawing parallels between mutant identity and Jewish identity. However, later in their story, Morrison writes about the culture that forms around mutant identity, including the rise of mutant celebrities such as fashion designer Jumbo Carnation, which can be seen as a reflection of the way LGBT culture has evolved over time. Other stories have tackled the mutant metaphor in a way where it represents disability, which is best seen through the character of Cyclops, whose vision has been permanently altered by his mutant power. Whereas blind or visually impaired characters are usually seen as helpless, Cyclops is the leader of the X-Men and isn't held back by his disability. A 2017 article from TheBias describes Cyclops as being in a perfect position to include people who are normally left out of heroic narratives. More recently in 2019, stories have been told where the mutant identity has been a stand-in for trans identity. In Uncanny X-Men issue 17, the character of Wolfsbane, who has the mutant ability to transform into a wolf, was hit on by a group of men, but upon realising that she was a mutant, they beat her to death. The way that the men thought Wolfsbane was tricking the men into thinking she was human is a direct parallel to how many men may believe that transgender women are tricking them. The subsequent attack on the character mirrors the idea of trans panic, a defence that's often used in cases of transphobic violence. Upon the issue's release, news sites and critics alike branded the story as thoughtless and in poor taste. The Mary Sue wrote that the writers shoehorned trans misogyny into the murder of a character who is not trans, in a misguided attempt at allegory. Chapter 5. Representation and the Fandom. The mutant metaphor and queer subtext that had been at the heart of the X-Men since the 1980s has formed what the fandom is today, with many who grew up reading these stories coming to realise their own sexuality, or feel more of an appreciation for their own culture as a result of these comic books. Cocca wrote that one of the strengths of the X-Men universe is in its queer families, its diverse characters who are not related through a traditional and nuclear patriarchal structure, but rather who choose each other as a family based on mutual love and support, which coincidentally seems to describe the X-Men fandom as well. Fandom is described as a subculture of people that all have an interest in a particular thing, usually a piece of pop culture. The Cerebro podcast is proof that a corner of the X-Men fandom has become a safe space for members of the LGBT community, black and ethnic minorities, and even others who may just feel socially excluded. The host of the show is a gay Jewish man, and each episode has a guest who usually fits into one if not multiple marginalised groups. On his podcast and in its wider community, fans have an equal voice, whether queer, black, disabled, trans, Jewish, female, neurodivergent, Hispanic, disabled, or generally outcast. And I think it's remarkably interesting to see how the X-Men have been relatable to people of so many different walks of life. Chapter 6. Adaptation. When Bryan Singer adapted the X-Men to the big screen in 2000, choices needed to be made as to which elements of the team's then nearly 40-year history would be brought onto the big screen. And the mutant metaphor was not only brought forward from the comics to live action, but made centre stage. The movie's first scene in present day has the mutant Jean Grey making a speech on mutants to a human governing body, who all seem to hate and fear these mutants. However, it's in 2003's X2 X-Men United that I feel the live action movies do their best work with the metaphor. The scene features students Iceman, Rogue and Pyro, along with teacher Wolverine, returning to the home of Iceman's parents, where he reunites with them for the first time since they sent him off to Xavier's school. The scene has Iceman essentially come out to his parents as a mutant, with his mother asking questions along the lines of, "When did you first know?" and "Have you tried not being a mutant?" Singer, as well as writers Zach Penn and David Hayter, as well as actor Ian McKellen, potentially wrote these lines to be akin to realistic reactions that arise from somebody coming out as gay, an experience both Singer and McKellen have been through. Although portrayed comedically in the movie, this scene is praised for its realism, and is one of the first times that queer voices have written for these characters. However, Singer has said that he never intended for his version of Iceman to be gay, but thinks it's interesting that in the early movies he develops a relationship with a girl who he's physically unable to touch. There's something subtextual in that. Chapter 7. Conclusion. So, does Lee and Kirby's metaphor hold up? And can comic books create powerful representation of marginalised groups through mere subtext and metaphor? Clearly, through fan reaction, we can see that the queer subtext of the 1980s has had a profound effect on queer youths within the community, and the message of the mutant metaphor is one that we should apply to people of all ethnic backgrounds in real life. To me, the metaphor works best when it intersects with another aspect of a character, such as Magneto's Jewishness, Nightcrawler's Catholic identity, Karma's identity as a paraplegic, or Maggot's identity as South African. This way, writers can still tell interesting stories about mutant identity, but have real life aspects that can tie to real life people that may be the reader. Now that the Comics Code Authority is being lifted, and we are seeing many more black and LGBT superheroes than ever before, we can see that people just prefer to see real representations of themselves and their culture over metaphors. 2018's Black Panther was the first superhero movie with a black lead, and made more money at the box office than any of the X-Men films, which represent the black community through metaphor alone. Similarly, on May the 13th, 2022, Marvel announced their first transgender mutant named Escapade, which was widely praised by fans and critics alike, much more than the trans panic issue of Uncanny X-Men just 3 years prior. Considering its rich 60-year history, you can pretty much guarantee that the representation across the X-Men isn't always going to be perfect. But since its inception with Stan and Jack all the way back in 1963, its heart has always been in the right place.